It's ironic that I didn't notice when I'd finished reading all of Kazuo Ishiguro's novels because it's a key component of this writer's style that revelations and explanations are sidelined and things are revealed almost by accident. They're not treated as though they're important, but as a sort of matter of course. Kazuo Ishiguro, he was born in the 50s in Nagasaki and moved to England when he was about 5 years old, I believe. And these are very English novels, although you can detect, and he does sort of use post-war Japan in his stories quite a bit. You can detect a bit of that essence, but it is mostly overwhelmed by an English sensibility. And this guy, I read most of these novels a few years ago. I kind of unintentionally slowly worked my way through most of them. And just recently I realized that, and I decided to see what else remained. As it turned out, I hadn't yet read, where are you? A Pale View of Hills, and a couple of the short stories. So I sort of went back through those, and I went back through Remains of the Day and Artist of the Floating World, and I decided I'd put a video together. So how should we talk about Kazuo Ishiguro? What are the main characteristics that you would look for when you came to this author and sort of decided to see what was going on? Well, there are quite a few things that all of these books have in common. A lot of the moments that he talks about are very awkward, but they're never quite explosive. There's a lot on memory and kind of things that were once the case that have now changed, and things that may or may not be regained. He writes in this deceptively simple prose that makes you think that you understand what's going on, but you really have to be paying much closer attention than you might expect at first. And so even though he has won some prize, or he's won a fair few prizes, I think those prizes are only awarded to him on the basis of what people kind of see on the outside, and they don't really get far enough into the book to see the true genius of it. Despite having won prizes, I still think he's quite underrated, actually. Of course, I mean, we all know what literary prizes are worth today. They're basically worthless, so that doesn't really tell you that much about him anyway. But there's a phrase that you'll hear thrown around, maybe, and I would say the phrase would be something like quietly devastating. I feel like that covers most, if not all, of the work. And it's because he does this. I think it's unique to him. He could have gotten this from somewhere else, but I think it's unique to Ishiguro. And he does this technique where all of the events with the most crushing emotional impact aren't narrated directly. They're always alluded to, they're anticipated, or they're remembered. Rarely does anything sort of that would make a change that would be the focal point of another kind of novel actually happen directly in the pages. Sometimes things like that do happen, but they're presented through the eyes of a child or through the eyes of a stranger who doesn't really understand what's going on. Anything that happens that's kind of directly responsible for a change or directly traumatic doesn't happen to the protagonist who's aware of what's going on, but always to someone else. And I thought about that. I wonder if that's because it's a weak spot of his. Because I know that it's very hard to write that sort of direct trauma. I've tried it before and it was pretty awful, my attempt, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And I wonder if this is just a way that he got around it and turned that disadvantage into his own style. It could be the case. But this has one very particular effect in that it makes the experience of Ishiguro's novels feel like watching a ripple spread out in a pond and having to infer the existence of a stone that was dropped into it, or looking at an arrow sticking out of a tree with a bit of cloth on it and kind of inferring the existence of a person running away. That's what it's like. You're never really looking at things head on. There's always a distortion. There are quite a few unreliable narrators, or at the very least narrators who are kind of unaware of the import of what they're saying, especially here and here, or they're unaware of what the audience paying attention to them would care about. And I suppose with that preamble, we should get into how you should approach this author and sort of what's worth looking at. So, introduction, Tier 1, the most essential stuff. Remains of the Day, unquestionably one of the two best, and The Unconsoled. Now, I suppose we should tackle the elephant in the room. You're going to hear Kazuo Ishiguro talked about and compared to Kafka constantly. And the chief inspiration for comparing him to Kafka is this book. Because this is so much like The Castle that it's ridiculous. This is a pianist in a Central European city who doesn't even quite understand all he knows is that he's supposed to give a performance at some grand opening for some kind of civic renewal. He's not even sure of the details, but things sort of pile themselves on over the top of each other, and he's never able to get a constant grip of what's going on. He'll be halfway through doing a task that somebody's asked him to do, and then somebody else will redirect him and ask him to do something else. It's that kind of... I think... Yeah. He never actually finishes doing a single task that he starts in this book. So it's the most frustrating thing to read if you're into these kinds of clean character arcs. But it's actually genius. This has got to be the best thing he wrote. Oh, man. So you've got to start with either one of these. This isn't quite like The Unconsoled. And The Unconsoled, actually, I should mention now, is kind of unique in that none of the rest of these books are really... They don't directly really ape The Castle like that. They're much more straightforward. And you can tell that The Unconsoled for Ishiguro was definitely an experiment, and it wasn't really his usual thing, because the rest of them, they're much more clear about what's going on. Which brings us to Remains of the Day. And a lot of people, when they compare Ishiguro to Kafka, they kind of stop with this and they say, oh, well, it's like The Castle because he gets redirected, he doesn't know what's going on, etc., etc. But I think that that comparison is kind of overused, and that he is like Kafka, but not in the way that everyone thinks he is. I think that he's a lot more like Kafka because he does this thing that Kafka does where a statement or an attitude that kind of comes out of nowhere becomes set in stone, and it becomes law, and it becomes this incontrovertible fact of the world, even though it shouldn't really be like that, because it's just something that someone has said. But when they say it, it has this kind of profound impact and completely changes the way that other people do things. So I took a note of an exact page of where something was, of where an example of this was. So sometimes it's not a statement, but it's a kind of a presence or an appearance or an idea or a phrase that just sounds reminiscent of Kafka, or like something that Kafka would do in the presentation of this inviolable wall. So there's a bit here where the protagonist's father, who is a butler just like the son, just like the protagonist of this, is taking a pair of very rowdy, drunken gentlemen on a road trip. And they're insulting his boss, and after a certain point, he doesn't say anything during the whole car ride. They just, they abuse the boss, and he just keeps driving and doesn't say anything until they come to a certain breaking point. And then we get this paragraph. The rear door of the car opened, and my father was observed to be standing there, a few steps back from the vehicle, gazing steadily into the interior. As Mr. Charles described it, all three passengers seemed to be overcome as one by the realization of what an imposing physical force my father was. Indeed, he was a man of some 6 feet 3 inches, and his countenance, though reassuring while one knew he was intent on obliging, could seem extremely forbidding viewed in certain other contexts. According to Mr. Charles, my father did not display any obvious anger. He had, it seemed, merely opened the door, and yet there was something so powerfully rebuking and at the same time so unassailable about his figure looming over them that Mr. Charles' two drunken companions seemed to cower back like small boys caught by the farmer in the act of stealing apples. Now, that just struck me as something that could have come straight out of one of Kafka's short stories. So these two are essential, and if you don't like these, don't bother with the rest, basically. But do try at least The Remains of the Day Out, because it really is very good. Second tier, The Buried Giant, and I don't have it, so I just use one of my notebooks to represent it through visuals. Never Let Me Go. Never Let Me Go is the one that everyone likes to talk about, but I didn't really remember liking it that much. I would have put it, actually, in the next couple of tiers, but I suppose there was skill in it. I wasn't that attracted to it, so we won't really talk about it that much. But don't fall down. No need for that. I have to move all sorts of stuff off my desk to fit all of this stuff on it. And then The Buried Giant. And The Buried Giant is very interesting because of what it has to say about memory, and for what it has to say about kind of small villages in pre-modern countries, and in pre-modern, I wouldn't call them nations, but in pre-modern places. And there's this idea that goes around, and this has nothing to do with the book, but I just want to talk about this just for a moment. There's an idea floating around in, how should we say, circles that like to talk about history, that everyone who lived in a particular country at a particular time would have been a full representative of that country. They would have been able to tell you as much as any modern democratic citizen. And of course that's not the case, because the fact of reality in the pre-modern era was that people were spread out all over villages, all over the place, and say some guy living in Asia Minor on a farm would not have been able to tell you the name of the emperor in Constantinople most of the time, let alone, who he was going to what was going on in the court or anything like that. Peasants and normal people who just lived away from the capital city wouldn't have known or cared about any of that stuff. The most interaction they would have ever had with any sort of king or any kind of royalty or contact with the capital would be any time the taxman came around and tried to collect their money and tried to collect some of their grain. They wouldn't care about anything else. People used to live largely totally deracinated, not deracinated, that's the wrong word, sorry, but they would have lived totally apart from their government in all but the most specialized of situations, and that's an idea that's kind of played with a lot in this book, because it's about a conflict that relies on people's memories to start up again. It's a conflict between Anglos and Saxons. And they basically, through some contrivance, it's Arthurian, right? So he can use magic as an excuse, and he has this magic mist that comes down over the country of Britain and makes people forget. And so Angles and Saxons are able to live next to each other and not really care about any sort of tribal differences. And that's the point, back in, let me think of it. Back in, say, 1639 in Greece, if one Turkish peasant moved into the Peloponnesian highlands while Greece was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, half the Greek people in the neighboring village, they wouldn't have cared that he was Turkish. They would have been too busy just trying to survive, and pay off taxes or whatever to the local emir. It's not a thing that enters your mind when you live in a far-off place like a village or anything like that. But we look back because everything's become much more centralized, and we tend to assume that people would have cared about that sort of thing beyond the impact it would have had for their own lives. So I think that this book is a good way to introduce people to the idea that that's not necessarily how things were. Okay, there's a lot more to it than that, of course, but that is one thing that it's good for. So I'll just put that back there. And we have the third tier. This is where he starts getting into more of the Japanese stuff. Now, Artist of the Floating World, I don't have too much to say about this. It's a lot like Remains of the Day, for a reason that will become very clear once you read it, but it's got much more of a focus on post-war Japan and on the passing of the baton between generations and all of that sort of thing, changing attitudes, the self-assessment versus the assessment of others. That's kind of what this book is all about. And it's pretty good, but, you know, this is King, so go with this. If you like this, then go with this. And Pale View of Hills. This was his first novel, and it's not so bad, but it's nothing supremely excellent. It's very Ishiguro, but I don't have much to say about it beyond, I mean, what I've said about all of them generally, you know. And so that's the next tier. And then the last tier, which is the stuff that you should only really bother with if you're a completionist. When We Were Orphans. I don't even think Ishiguro likes this book. I think he tried to do something that was kind of interesting, which is kind of overturn a detective novel to make the detective into this kind of unself-aware child. And he's, you know, the character Christopher Banks is kind of a joke, but it doesn't really come across like that. You know, there's something to be said for not understanding a novel and having to reread it again carefully, but when even the author admits that the trick wasn't pulled off quite as well as he would like, maybe we can just move on past it. And then Nocturnes. And I'm kind of going to use Nocturnes as a stand-in for all of the short stories, because there are quite a few that I don't have physically, but that I just read on my phone. You can just download a bunch of the other ones. So we've got the stuff in here. What are the stories in here? Nocturnes. Crew, No Come Rain, No Come Shine, Malvern Hills, Nocturne and Cellist. And they all kind of deal with the same theme of trying to recapture a lost love, you know, and deal with change and all of that sort of thing, which is why they're all collected in this one edition. And then you have all of the other remaining short stories, which are stuff that Ishiguro wrote when he was much younger, and stuff that just appeared in magazines. You know, some of them, I don't even think they were ever actually printed. But there's something like A Village After Dark, there's Waiting for Jay, Family Supper, A Strange and Sometimes Sadness, Getting Poisoned, which is totally unlike anything else he wrote, except in the fact that there's a child narrating it who doesn't understand what's going on, and that the story isn't central to the experience. There's Summer After the War and October 1948, which are really just excerpts and a different take on theirs. And I don't really have too much to say about them because they're really just more of all of the other stuff, which is very good stuff, you know. And maybe it would be a good idea to start with A Village After Dark. Village After Dark is probably the most Kafka-esque of the short stories. And it reminds me very much of Kafka in that there's this one particular scene where the protagonist, who's visiting a village after dark, obviously, kind of walks into the house of people that he barely knows, and they kind of half-heartedly offer him hospitality, and he just says, look, I need to sleep. He sleeps on the bed, and by the time he's woken up, they're totally denouncing his character, which is extremely Kafka. That's the other aspect of Kafka that nobody ever talks about. The irreversible action that always leads to disaster, that's taken despite what the protagonist really wants to do, but they have to do it. That's a very Kafka thing that I don't see too many people ever talking about. So that's kind of an introduction to Kazuo Ishiguro. Definitely try this one if you haven't already. And this one's pretty good, etc., etc. He's a very good author, really. I don't know why more people don't talk about him. He's got another book coming out next year as well, which I suppose I'll be looking forward to it now, although I wouldn't have said that a month ago. Oh, also, I have some new updates. I've decided to put some short stories up on my website, and I've revamped the poetry because it was kind of rubbish before, and I decided to, you know, fix it up a bit and maybe put some new ones on there. So if you're interested, check it out. I mean, I'm not saying I'm Anton Chekhov or something. I'm just saying, you know, it might be of interest. Anyway, that's it.